Hello, my name is Beth Hoy and I am the Next Gen Ministry Facilitator for the Baptist Churches of South Australia. And today I'm really excited to bring to you this interview that I recently did with Jake Mulder. Jake is the co-author of this fantastic book, Growing Young, which seeks to give strategies to churches to help young people to thrive in their communities. He's also the Senior Director of Strategy at the Fuller Youth Institute in the US. He comes with a wealth of experience from his journey as a youth pastor and a missionary and also a researcher. And he just had so much to say and I really enjoyed talking to him. This video resource we're calling Reconnect and Reform, and it has been created to help equip ministries as they're looking to regather post-COVID-19 restrictions. So as the restrictions begin to lift across the nation, we really wanted to give something to the churches to help you think deeply about what it looks like to reform and regather. This interview was created specifically with children's ministry, youth ministry, and young adult ministries in mind. And so if you're gathering as your team tonight, I really hope and pray that what Jake has to share with us will help you guys to think big, to dream big, and to seek God as you strategize and think about what it means to move forward and to regather as the COVID-19 restrictions begin to lift. And so if you want to unpack the content of this video further, don't forget to download the worksheets that we've created to go along with it. Hopefully they'll be helpful for you and your team. And without further ado, here is my interview with Jake Mulder. So Jake, thank you so much for joining us today. We, as you would be aware, we find ourselves at a very strange moment in history. And we want to really focus in on today on what the impact that COVID-19 and pandemic restrictions has had on our globe and on our church, and helping leaders to think about what it looks like to move forward now as restrictions begin to lift for us in Australia. So first of all, I'm wondering if you would start by telling us what some of your reflections are on how this moment in history has impacted the church and specifically the emerging generations.
Yeah, certainly. And thanks, Beth. It's great to be with you and everyone else who is watching this at some point. So I work for a group called the Fuller Youth Institute, which is part of Fuller Seminary, and so many things I could say about young people in the pandemic, but a way I want to organize my response, we like to think that young people, we've also researched the fact that young people, we think they're asking several big questions about the world, questions about their identity. So those are questions, who am I? Questions about their belonging, which is where do I fit? And then questions about their purpose, which is what difference do I make in the world? And all of those questions are related. And even if they're not asking those questions out loud, we think those questions are driving most of the decisions that they make and actions. So all of those things get very much shaped by people's experience. And I think for many of us, no matter our age watching this, when we think back to some of those definitive, our views on the world today, often they came from the experiences that they had. So to tie this back together, I think that for young people who have lived through this pandemic, it shaped their identity, belonging, and purpose. But I think I want to point out it's probably shaped their sense of belonging and their sense of purpose more than just about anything. So, okay, if I unpack that for just a second.
Yes, please.
So belonging is about our sense of connection to others, right? And if you think about what's happened in the midst of the pandemic, young people went from kind of the overall realities of their life, where connecting with friends, spending time at school, maybe there's sports, maybe there's the arts, some time at home. But for a lot of modern young people, that's to come at home at night and sleep or get their homework done or have a quick conversation with mom or dad or grandpa and grandma, whoever that is. Most young people went through a pretty dramatic shift when we were locked down in COVID, where their sense of belonging actually moved from connection at school or a connection in sports to, for better or for worse, I'm mostly at home and I belong with family or with whoever it is that I'm at home with. That's going to shape us in particular ways. Same thing when it comes to our sense of purpose. Most of us, when we think about what we want to do in the world, are shaped either by people around us that we saw who were shining examples of something, or we might have experienced some sort of injustice. So I'm a millennial. I'm in my 30s. An event that shaped me quite a lot in the United States. I was in high school when September 11 happened, right? So part of my identity, part of my sense of purpose in the world was shaped by this traumatic event that happened. And I think that that's going to look different for many young people, because for some young people, they were actually sheltered at home in a very safe, loving environment. And that's going to shape them in a particular way. For another group of young people, they have not been in a very safe or loving environment. So that's going to shape them in a different way. So I could say more, but I'll start with that, thinking about it in terms of their identity, belonging, and purpose.
Yeah. And what about you personally, Jake? What have your personal experiences been firsthand in your church, but also in your family?
Yeah, so thankfully, or I guess for better or for worse, we have not been near as adversely affected as a lot of people that we know. So I haven't lost my job in this situation. My wife, so my wife's name is Lauren, and then we have two kids, Will and Theo. Will is 5 and Theo is 2. Lauren was already mostly spending her time, taking care of the home, taking care of the kids. So it didn't cause as much disruption for us. Now for our kids, our 5-year-old thinks that this is the best thing that's ever happened in the world because he doesn't have to go to school. I travel a fair amount for work, so I'm not having to travel. For his reality, this is a very sweet season. Now, we have relatives, we have members of our church, very different season. Employment within our context is skyrocketing. So I know a lot of, let's just take teenagers for a second. I have a cousin who lives nearby, and her reality before COVID was excitement about the college or university that she was going to go to, was enjoying senior year and prom. Do you all have prom in Australia? Is prom some?
We call it the formal, the high school formal.
Formal, right? Yeah. So all those things, the formal's been canceled, right? The whole end of the school year is canceled. One of her parents lost their job. So like the university that she's been talking about is likely going to shut down in-person classes for the fall. So looking at that reality, this is not like a hopeful, peaceful season. This is everything in my life has been thrown into disarray. And I know we'll get to this more in a minute. There's been trends in a lot of Western countries, US, Australia, to say, oh, faith is becoming less and less relevant. I think this is a moment for the church to step in. And when you think about how and where, and going back to that sense of belonging, what do young people need more than anything else right now? To know they're loved, cared for, there's stability, there's a purpose out there. What else is the church supposed to be other than that, right? Now I'm going to go into, I think we'll go into more in a minute, but I just want to reference while we're on it. Yes, young people need that from their peers, but you start to ask, who do they need that from more than anyone else? It's adults in the church. It's family. It's surrounding them, right? They need those meaningful connections to shape who they are and what they're going to do. So I know you have good questions, so I'll let you take it deeper than that.
But I like how you're saying there's a real need to read the situation for your context and for individuals, because what has been actually very traumatic for one person may actually have been a really beautiful season of rest for another. And it's important that we're thinking about that whole spectrum of experiences as we're moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say a dangerous phrase that we've seen from adults is to respond to young people primarily with this, when I was your age, right? Because we read back, well, when I was your age, we had life really hard. Why are you complaining? And I don't think it's about comparing whose life was harder. It's about resonating with and empathizing with what is this person going through. I was a senior in high school once, and if the end of my senior year had gotten canceled, that would have felt like the biggest deal in the world to me. Mm-hmm. Now I can look at that now and look at seniors and say, oh, get over it. It's not that big of a deal, right? But that's not empathy, and that's not taking someone else's perspective.
Absolutely. That's fantastic, Jake. Thank you. So in Australia, we're in a quite a good position where the social restrictions are beginning to be lifted from state to state. And we're actually just at the point now where we're able to have some physical gatherings once again in the church, and they're small at the moment, but we have a lot of our generation's leaders who are currently gathering to think about
what does it look like to come back together? And so to begin with, I want to ask you, what would you see as the whole church perspective, not just the individual ministry, but what's the whole church responsibility as we begin to think and dream moving forward?
Yeah, again, so many directions we could go. So I'll pick what I think is one important direction. In essence, I mean, what I think the church needs to be in this season and what the whole church needs to be in this season, I guess I'm kind of a traditionalist, or I like to boil things down to their essence. So I really think it's to live into the call that the church has always had to be the church. Now, in some ways that can sound very basic, very reductionistic, but I don't think the call is simply to do church or go to church or show up for services. None of those are necessarily bad things. But the essence of this is to be the church. Now, I'll explain what I mean through a couple of references to scripture. One that comes to mind is Acts chapter 2, right? So a picture that we see of the early church, Acts 2:42 through 46. We certainly see that the church is gathering in the temple courts. And depending on your translation, I mean, we have large group gatherings. I think we should. But what we see was really the heartbeat of the church was the idea that they're meeting in each other's homes. They're sharing meals. They're praying together. From the core, that's been part of what it means to be the church. Let's move to Paul for a second. 2 Corinthians 5, specifically starting in verse 11. Paul has what I would say is one of the best summaries of the gospel for today, because he talks about the ministry of reconciliation. And again, 2 Corinthians 5:11 and following, he talks about what God has done is through Jesus, God has restored and reconciled the world. And God has invited us into that restoration and reconciliation. Paul could have stopped there, but he doesn't say God has just done this and it's all done. Paul says, and now God has invited us into this. He says, you are ambassadors, you are ministers of reconciliation. So in a broken world where there are challenges and young people and others who need belonging, I mean, I'm aware of the news that's happening these days about racism and brokenness. I think the world desperately needs reconciliation. God's choosing to work through us. Here's the reality of that. If you see young people or others who are saying, I don't find the church that exciting, I don't find the church that compelling, they're not just talking about the church generally, they're talking about people. They're talking about the Christians that they have come across aren't that compelling. They don't feel like they're living out that sense of reconciliation. Now, I don't just want to parse out the good, the bad of the church, but I really think in this moment and in this season, what the church is called to, the whole church, because again, we could point to other spots in Corinthians that talk about the churches. It's the body of Christ, right? It's the priesthood of all believers. It's not just the young people over here and older people over here. This is all of us together living out that sense of reconciliation. I can say more, but curious what direction you want to take that.
I love that. So what you're saying is, because at the moment this resource is designed for ministry teams, and as far as the teams, it's important for them to consider this not just their responsibility as an individual ministry, but it's actually just a Christ-following responsibility to follow that call to restore humanity through the love of Jesus, what just as we express as humans.
Yeah, and I'll bring the research into it, because again, research is one of the things that we spend a whole lot of time doing. For our research in the book Growing Young, we talked to hundreds and hundreds of young people and asked them, why do you love your church so much? These are young people, they love the church that they're a part of. And the number one response that came back was they said, I love this church because it feels like a family, right? Feels like a family. And what they ended up doing was unpacking that sense of belonging, that sense of connection. And for a younger generation, they didn't point to primarily the services, the mission trips, the music, all the things that we could point to. They pointed to that sense of connection with other people. So I think that if we're going to live out, this post-COVID reality, is asking questions about how can relationship be at the core of that. And one of the exercises that I really like to do, so if you're in a ministry team watching this, get out a sheet of paper, take out a whiteboard, and put a little circle, or draw like a stick person, to use that phrase, a stick person, right? So just draw a stick person, make it a teenager, make it a real teenager, or child, like 8-year-old, not just a generic young person, but a real one that and just start to map out who are the influences in that young person's life. I mean, mom or dad or grandpa or grandma or other family member, caregiver, teachers, coaches, all the other media, all the different pieces. And when we start to do that sort of exercise, hopefully church is in there somewhere. But what we start to see is there are a lot of forces that are influencing our young people today. And just asking the question, okay, whoever are some of the strongest influences in their life, and my guess is some of those are going to be people, how do we invite those people to take a Jesus-centered perspective? How do we invite, and if you're in children's ministry, if you're in youth ministry, part of what I would argue is it's not just your call to do ministry to or ministry for that young person. It's to advocate for that young person. It's to surround them with an environment of other people who will care about and shape them. I think that's some of the calling of the church in the season of COVID.
I love that because it shifts the perspective as well from how do we run a program to how do we journey with young people to help them to understand the church is a place where they're loved and they belong. And the good news about it is also that you don't have to be a cool 22-year-old to lead youth ministry or an experienced mother to lead children's ministry. You just have to be humans to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe this after a lot of research and training of churches. We spend so much time looking at what other churches do or looking at what curriculum tells us to do. I think we really need to listen to our young people. Yes, I think some of us just need to pay attention to what really formed or shaped us. So another powerful exercise I've seen is just spend some time journaling and think about when you were a younger person, what were the strongest influences in your faith? If you were a person of faith, if you're following Jesus, what most helped you follow Jesus? And when I do that exercise, 9 times out of 10, it becomes people, most often adults or peers who poured into you, who shaped you, who invested in you. Even if that happened through a church program, my guess is that it was someone through that program or someone involved in that program. So oftentimes, if we'll just go back to that reality, it allows us to tap into something really important and meaningful.
Fantastic. I love your whole church perspective there, and hopefully that's given some tools and some stuff for our ministry teams to think about as they're watching this. So still thinking about that context of the teams who are now preparing, we've talked about the whole church perspective. So zoning in on what it looks like to reform a ministry, like if we're talking about ministry programs that help to facilitate healthy relationships and make space for people to relate to each other, what are some important things that our ministry leaders can be thinking about now as they're thinking about how they're going to reform, particularly as the restrictions are being lifted gradually?
Yep.
We can instantly go back to what we had. So what are some important things that you would want to see ministry teams thinking about?
Yeah, so I think one, in a season of change, it's very easy for us to get focused on all of the things that are changing, right? And often youth ministry, children's ministry has been very good at adapting to the things that are changing. And I think when I think about youth ministry, children's ministry, that's often been the innovation arm of the church. It's been where we think of the newest, best things oftentimes. Well, while that's a strength, I think sometimes we as kids pastors, youth leaders, we spend too little time focusing on what will never change. And I think that that's a question worth asking yourself as everything has changed, right? What are those things that haven't changed that remain consistent? Now I'm going to go back to some words that I used before. Identity, belonging, and purpose. I think that when it comes to following Jesus, when it comes to our faith, we need faith for young people to shape young people's identity. Identity is, how do I view myself? Do I think that I'm not enough? Do I think that I'm terrible? Do I think that I don't measure up? Or do I know who I am in Christ? Our faith needs to shape our sense of belonging, that we see, our people are the Christians around us who love, support us, will love us unconditionally. That faith shapes our sense of purpose for a lot of young people who are asking, what do I want to be when I grow up? How do I make a difference in the world? Does faith, this church really matter? That again, our discipleship efforts are shaping the way that young people see the world in those 3 areas. That's a little bit about the what. But The other part is the who. And I really want to go back to here. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. The research reveals time and time and time again that the strongest spiritual influence in the life of a kid is that kid's family. It's often mom or dad or grandpa or grandma. If we're going to take that seriously as we come out of COVID, how do we actually help young people's parents know how to support them in their faith? An intergenerational community of adults. Every time the research reveals how critical that they are. So I think we need to not get stuck in everything that's changing, right? We need to zero in on what will never change. But then I think giving ourselves some freedom to adapt and experiment and say, let's try some new things. I heard a speaker that I respect say, this is an era, because so many things are changing, that you can try something new and hold it together with duct tape, and that's okay, because everything is just in this season of flux. This might be a season for you to try something new, and I'd encourage you. So that would be one.
Excellent. So you're encouraging our teams to get excited, to think big, and to be energized by that. And I'd love to add my encouragement to the teams out there. Dream big, pray big, and be expectant in these times. And what about capturing vision? So, I mean, you mentioned what's never changed. Do our missions and values change because the world has changed, or is that something that remains the same?
Yeah, I would like to say that our mission and our values should rarely change. It's our strategy that often needs to change. And I don't know if this analogy will be helpful or not, but for anybody who's ever been on a boat, especially if it's a rowboat. So if you're in a rowboat, and does that term, do you use the same term rowboat? You don't call it something else? Okay, like a dinghy, or a dinghy and a rowboat wouldn't be the same. Something with oars that you're actually rowing.
Got it.
Now, if you want to row in a particular direction, you need to know where you're headed. Let's say that you need to get back to the dock that you came from. You actually need to figure out which direction is that dock, because if you're rowing in the wrong direction, you're going to end up in the wrong direction. So that's the first part. I'll talk about that in a second. The second piece is, once you actually know where you're headed, you need to be moving the oars at the right cadence and rhythm that's going to get you there. Now, I said I have a 5-year-old son. So if anyone has ever rowed with a 5-year-old on the other oar, it doesn't usually get you where you want to go. You'll just kind of spin in circles because you're rowing and they may or may not be. I'm going to apply that to our ministry now, although it's fun just to think about a boat and rowing. I think for many of us, we don't, if our ministry is the boat, we don't quite know where we're headed. And we're just kind of open of, it feels good to row. I like being in a boat. We like doing ministry, but we don't actually know where we're headed. So I think a practice that I really like to do with teams is to think about vision as a shared story of future hope. Okay, so vision as a shared story of future hope. One of my colleagues at Fuller Seminary, Scott Cormode, he's a leadership professor at the seminary. He uses this term, shared story of future hope. If it's shared, it means it's something that doesn't just emerge from one person, it's communal. Story means it's not just like a bullet point statement on the wall. It's in story form. In a future hope, it taps into this idea that as Christians, we are a people of hope. We're people of the resurrection. So practically, what I think that can mean for you, I love to see churches take either young people that they know in their ministry and ask this question for an 8-year-old. When they're in their 20s, let's just write up a story of what do we hope their life would look like in light of their faith, right? So fast forward time a little bit, write that up. And then ask the question, what would our ministry need to look like to help that young person accomplish or be that? It might just unlock things in a different way. The other approach that I would say is, if you don't start with a young person, start with your whole church and just picture 10 or 15 years from now, and in a story, right? Write it up as a story, not just bullet points. What do we hope our church might look like in 2030? What would we be doing? If it's the church that I loved and wanted to be a part of and was excited to be a part of, what might it be? I think that's a really powerful exercise coming out of the pandemic here. Now, a whole nother topic is how we actually align there. That's the rowing. That's strategy.
Yes.
But one first part, we have to figure out where we're going. Then we can figure out how to get there.
That's a great analogy. I really like that. And I love the idea of storing ahead of time, because if we don't do that, we'll just default to we're very influenced by the values of our culture. And so what success and happiness looks like to our culture is going to be a very different story of what success and happiness looks like from a Christ gospel perspective. And so I love that intentionality.
Well, and I mean, just to make this tangible, I haven't met a church that's not focused on making disciples. Let me say that a different way. Most every church I know, if I read their mission statement, their goals, they would say, we want to make disciples of Jesus in some way, shape, or form. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Mm. I think that term is something we've used so much that many of us have lost knowing what it even looks like. So I know you're in Adelaide. Being a disciple in Adelaide might look a little bit different than being a disciple in Sydney or Los Angeles or Detroit. Now, the principles are the same, but the way that you live that out in your culture might look different, which is why it's really important to think about real people that you know and talk about if they were, not just how do we make disciples generally, but if we were focused on this young person and they were living as a disciple, what might that look like, right? So I really think zeroing in on that is important.
Fantastic. Now, as we're thinking about responding to our current circumstances, you said some great thing. Well, we kind of unpacked earlier the need to listen and to read the situation. Can you unpack that a little bit more, what it might look like for us to respond in our moment to individuals?
Yep. So this is that idea we're talking about with the oars, right? Like you need to know where you're headed, but then you need to actually be paddling at the right rhythm. And one of those pieces that we need to do is listen. And so tangibly, I think this just means we know our people and we don't just assume we know that where they're coming from. So there's a church in Minnesota that we worked with a while ago. They really wanted to have more young adults in their church. And they got together, their leadership did, and said, oh, we know young adults. They don't like traditional Sunday morning services. They want really hip, really cool Sunday night service with loud music and all this. So they came to us because we've done research and written books on this. And they said, so we're going to start a Sunday night service for young adults. Do you think that's a good idea? And our response to them was, well, because most of these people are over age 40, which is fine. No offense to anyone over age 40, right? But we said, well, when you talk to the young adults in your church, what did they say? And they kind of looked at each other and weren't quite sure what to say in response. And they said, yeah, we didn't talk to our young adults. And we said, well, go ahead and talk to your young adults and then come back to us. They talked to the young adults, came back to us, and they said, yeah, the young adults, they don't want a Sunday night service. And we said, oh, that's interesting. What do they want? And they said, we're really shocked. What they want is mentoring and relational connection. They actually want older people in the church to invest time and energy in them, to pour into them, to help them figure out. Now, that revolutionized the approach that the church was going to take. They were going to invest money and staff time and volunteer time, all of these things to develop a Sunday night service. They hadn't taken the step to listen. And whether you're getting in touch with families, getting in touch with kids, getting in touch with teenagers, young adults, I think that listening work can shape who we are and what we do.
So if we were talking about talking to our young people about what they need and what they want in this moment, what might be some helpful questions for leaders to ask families and young people?
Yeah, so I think I will answer your question, but even before getting to the questions, I think that there's a sense of, have you earned the right to be heard? And I think some of us might approach young people as, well, it's my job to talk and it's their job to listen. For anyone who's gone to an older child or teenager before and asked questions and gotten very simple one-word responses, it's not always the easiest thing. And I think that there's a sense of needing to respect that the level of depth you're going to go to in your questions needs to correspond with the relationship that you have with this young person. So if you've never, let's say you used to show up to church every Sunday, you always walk past this young person, you've never spoken to them, you don't even know their name. And you're going to walk up to them and say, hey, what do you want? What do you want this church to be like? They might kind of be, why are you asking me? Or not really sure. So let me just say first, it's tapping into young people who maybe they don't even go to our church, but they're our niece, our nephew, and depending on who's doing the asking. But beyond that, I really am into, there's a whole theory and field of thought known as appreciative inquiry. And here's what appreciative inquiry says, basically. The conversations that we have are shaped by the questions that we ask.
Right.
Okay. The conversations we have are shaped by the questions that we ask. So if with a young person, if most of our questions are what don't you like, what's wrong, what's broken, we start to get responses that are focused on the negative.
Yes.
So I would be in favor of asking positive leading questions. So going to a young person and starting with, just, hey, what are you interested in? How do you spend your time? What do you like doing? That's just letting that young person talk about what they care about. We like questions around things like, when's the time that you've experienced God? Have you ever felt God's presence or known that God was there? Who's an adult in this church who you really look up to or admire? What's something in the world that you think the church could respond to? But it's trying to, and this requires empathy, right? Empathy. It's the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to actually take someone else's perspective. And many times we need to actually step out of our own perspective to try and step into a young person's perspective, which is where if you're in your 50s or 60s and you feel totally disconnected from teenagers, you might want to start with the teenager's parents, right? Like a 60-year-old talking to a 40-year-old might feel like enough of a step for some of us. But yeah, trying to think of the relationship that we have, and do we have the right to ask some of the questions we're trying to ask?
I think that's so helpful for our context in Australia, as how we shape the questions to kind of point out the positive rather than the negative, because as a culture, we are quite sarcastic and we're much more comfortable in critique than we are in encouragement. And I don't think that's like, there's exceptions to the rules, but I think as leaders, it's really important that we focus on the positive and realize that the gospel is life-bringing rather than breeding a generation of cynics. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, well, and just one quick comment. I mean, even a question like, let's say a young adult in our church who grew up in the church. It's one thing to go up to them and say, hey, why don't you go to church anymore, right? If they don't show up as they might. And on the one hand, it's easy to assume, oh, this young person doesn't care, they whatever. What if they're in a line of work where their job requires them to be at work on Sunday? They have no choice. They're a doctor and they're in the early stages of rotations, all that stuff. I think oftentimes our questions reveal our assumptions, and our assumptions can be very dangerous.
That's great. That's really gold. And just to step back as well, what you were saying about having the relationship and the permission to ask questions. I suppose if this video is going out to churches who find themselves in a position where they don't know if they can approach their young people, it gives them a starting place. So start building those relationships now, so that the next time that there's crisis, and the next time we're fostering change, you have a new starting place to actually ask them what they want and need.
Yeah, well, and let's push deeper there for a second, because we often will hear from some people, adults, senior leaders, who say, well, why is it my responsibility to go to the teenager? They could come to me, right? I've heard that logic before. And my favorite response is, because that's what God did for you. Right. And I think that if we really want to go deep, we could dig into theological concepts of the incarnation, of Emmanuel, the fact that God is with us. Part of the whole point of Jesus coming was that, we've got God up here, distant, feeling far away to some, but Scripture unpacks over and over. No, we have a God who is not distant, who is not far away. We have a God who has come to us, who has walked like us, who knows what it's like to be with us. So I actually think when we take that action to step into a young person's world, to develop that relationship, to understand where they're coming from, we're doing good theology. I think we're fulfilling the mandate of what we've been called to as Christians and what Jesus has done for us. Now, not even going into Paul's, I've become like a Jew to win the Jews. I've taken on the perspective of all sorts of different people, so that by all means, I may reach and connect. My paraphrase, but yeah, so I think it's good theology.
It's applied theology. It's not
very much
in action, and that's really what theology is for.
Yep, very much.
My last question for you, Jake, is one that's very much immersed in our context. I haven't talked to enough leaders across the globe and the nation to know whether this is everywhere, but the season of change for the church, everything's turned around so quickly. Our leaders, particularly our generations leaders, are just very tired, and they're working a lot of hours, and they've had to adapt very quickly, change up the whole format of ministry, and now just as quick as they've changed to settle into something, they're having to change back. So what would some of your thoughts be, or some of your advice be for leaders who are finding themselves worn out at this time, and also who may perhaps be impacted by the pandemic themselves and find themselves trying to process that well?
Yeah, I mean, I think first there's kind of this image out there of the super pastor or the super leader who can do everything and never get tired. And I just think that's not a very biblical idea. I think many of us like the idea of trying to be God or play God, but we don't always recognize that we're human. And so I think from there, I just want to start by saying and recognizing it's hard. This is a hard season.
Yes.
And I'll say particularly we have a number of staff and leaders we've been interacting with who are people of color. And again, in our U.S. context, with some of the things that have been going on, this is a particularly difficult season for a number of people of color, not only for leaders generally where the pandemic has hit, but now with the weight of everything else that's going on. And no matter what your perspective on all these issues, just it's brought a layer of weight that is particularly tiring. So I want to recognize that. I don't have an easy answer, but I have what I think is the right answer. And I know because I was taught this in Sunday school, but it holds true. This really is a season to focus our eyes on Jesus. And I don't just mean the cosmic disconnected Jesus or Christ who saves us from our sins, although that's certainly a very important Jesus. I mean the very human Jesus that we see in Scripture.
Yes.
Because instead of trying to be this version of whoever we think we should be that can get it all done, if we'll zero in on the example that Jesus sets in Scripture, and I'm just talking the Gospels, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, right? So part of my response is go read your Bible. We actually see Jesus getting tired.
Yes.
We see Jesus pulling back to rest and pray. We see Jesus with his disciples, yes, sending them out to minister and do these things. But we actually see Jesus saying, hey, we need to get away from the crowds for a little bit. We need some time to rest. And I think if you need a spot to camp out, John chapter 10 through 16, 17 or so, and when Jesus gets into, I'm the vine, you are the branches, apart from me, you can do nothing. And that invitation to stay connected to the vine, to stay connected to Jesus. I think this is the season. And let me counterbalance that with, and this is a moment, this is a season of opportunity. I think that as we're returning from the lockdown, from needing to social distance, get back to church, there's some psychological principles here, sociological principles that when change has occurred, particularly a crisis or something of that nature, it actually unlocks people's openness and their potential to things being different. And we're in a moment, and there is a window, particularly with you all ahead of us in Australia, there's a moment to try some things and change some things because so many things have just changed. So asking yourself, part of the question that I would ask if you're finding yourself balanced and ready to move forward, what is a hope or dream for ministry that you have had in this season? And might now be the time for you to actually activate it, might now be the time for you to live in, to act on it. So a couple different perspectives there.
How exciting, really, to ask that question and give ourselves permission to try something new, to not be afraid of failure.
Yep, very much.
Jake, I'll just give you one last chance if there's anything sort of burning on your mind, on your heart that you wanted to share with us before we wrap up this interview.
Oh my, I want to say this without it sounding trite or cliche. and I forgot, I'm going to misquote whoever it was that said this, but that Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, someone great like that. I wish I had the quote. It's the end of the day here, but that we really do need to be the change that we hope to see in the world. And I think that I have just been around person after person who is frustrated with the brokenness of the world, or the political divides, or the economic challenges. I think this is such a moment of hope for the church to step up and be the church. And I can't speak much to Australia, but my hope and prayer for US churches is that we're not just known for whether or not we're breaking social distancing rules, or like which side of the political divide that we're on, but that people would say the church, Christians, they so exemplify Jesus. They demonstrate what it means to live the way of Jesus, that it just inspires a whole sense of hope and confidence. I really think that this can be one of those unique seasons for the church to step up, and not just the church, but you, whoever's listening to this webinar, thinking about a young person, a neighbor, whoever it is that needs to see Jesus's reality. Maybe we'll finish where we started, 2 Corinthians 5. Ministers of reconciliation. You are Christ's ambassadors, as if we are making God's case for God. It's a moment of opportunity to be the church.
Jake, you've given us so much to think about, and I just love your passion and the depth in which you're talking about what it looks for us as the church to move forward. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Beth. So great to be with you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you got a lot out of that. Don't forget to grab your worksheets, use the cheat sheets if you need to go back and watch parts of the video again. And as you gather now in your teams to think and strategize, pray big, dream big, but more importantly, let's just be the people of God that we're called to be to each other in these times. Later in the year, we'll be producing another video, another interview that we've done with Jake to help us to understand how to equip strong young leaders in our church. So stay tuned for that as well. God bless.